Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about F1 legends. Welcome back, and we're on to the next decades of this retrospective series, the 70s and 80s, an era when the guys were racing and, well, I was in diapers. In my humble opinion, it's super cool to hear how John and Dick's passion and heroes for racing led them down the path of pursuing their racing dreams. But before we get to the conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, Dick, we are now in a new era in our F1 legends, the 70s and 80s. And we had a lot of options to choose from, but you had to make the judgment call, and I'm glad you made that one. I wanted to add names like Mario Andretti, Jody Scheckter, Alan Jones, Gilles Villeneuve, and Didier Pironi and Nigel Mansell, and yet those names didn't make it on the list. Doesn't mean that we won't ever talk about them in the future. But for this purpose, you came up with our list, and the first one is the youngest world champion winning his first title. So tell us that name and also tell us how you came up with this list, please.
Sure thing. So let's start with the list first. So what I wanted to do, you talk about Mario, and Mario is one of my guys. And when I first met Mario, I was sort of, north of 55 when I met him, and I acted like I was probably 14. So, that's one of my guys. And Jody Scheckter, Alan Jones, Mansell, all those guys, world champions, but one-time winners of the world championship. Gilles Villeneuve, legendary. Pironi, not as well known, but still in his time, he was a heck of a racing driver, right? All of those guys were amazing. But they were only one-time world champions, and only. They have one more than me. And so, I had to draw a line somewhere, and I said, okay, what about the guys that had 2 world championships or more? And if you think about this era, really starting in both the 70s and the 80s, there were several drivers who actually won just one world championship. And, great examples. Andretti, Scheckter, Jones, all of those guys won one world championship. So did Keke Rosberg. And I would be willing to bet, I haven't gone back and actually figured it out, but I would bet you that in those 20 years, there were more guys to win one world championship over the last 20 years than we've had in the 20 years from 2000 onward. Let's call it 24 years, because honestly, the only 3 world champions that I can think of in the last 24 years that only won one was Kimi and Nico and Jensen. Now, I may be missing one, but I think it was just 3 out of 24 years. Whereas I'm pretty sure that in the 70s and 80s, the number was something larger than that. It goes to show that lately we've been having a situation where guys are stringing together multiple world championships, like we saw with Max, and prior to that, Lewis, and prior to that, we had Vettel winning 4 in a row, and then we had Schumacher winning like 4 in a row. So, it eats up a lot of each decade when you have a guy that's winning 4 world championships or more. So my point being is that in many respects, you can make the argument that the teams were way more competitive, and the cars were much more closely matched. So with that being said, the 80s, the 70s and the 80s had some surprises. And one of the big surprises was Emerson Fittipaldi, first guy on our list. Had a very interesting career. He really kind of burst on the scene when nobody was really looking for some kid from Brazil to just suddenly show up and be as bloody quick as he was. He was named after Ralph Waldo Emerson, believe it or not. And and at the time, he was the youngest world champion. He won his first title when he was 25 years old. But how he got there was crazy. He was actually studying mechanical engineering in Brazil, and so he actually got involved in karting, and with his brother, um, he he designed a steering wheel that first went into his mother's car. People liked it, and so they started producing these steering wheels, and started selling them. And they used that to fund their kart racing. And then they decided, well, we'll build our own go-kart. And so they started building their own go-kart. And then when it was time to move up the cars, they built their own Formula V. So, I mean, he had, again, like so many of these other guys, had some real mechanical sympathy. Remember when we talked about guys like Fangio and Brabham? Those guys, they were mechanics before they became racing drivers. And this is sort of the same story here with Fittipaldi. Anyway, he went to England, could barely speak English, but he won in Formula Ford, moved into Formula 3, and in both of the, spent a year in each class, dominated. And so Colin Chapman with Lotus signed him to a full-time deal in Formula 2. And towards the end of the 1970 season, he said, you know what, in addition to your Formula 2 duties, let's go ahead and put you in as a part-timer, and I'm just going to run a third Lotus for you in Grand Prix. And back in those days, you could do that kind of stuff. You got a promising talent, you need to give him some experience, we'll just enter a third car. Can you imagine that happening today? You think about all the young talent sitting on the sidelines, and the best they can hope for is to do a young driver's test or maybe a free practice one during the year, and the rest of the time they're stuck on the simulator. This time, no simulators. It was just, let's stick you in the car and see how you go. So, in only his second Grand Prix, the guy finishes fourth, which to this day, that's pretty staggering. And then 2 races later, they go to Italy for the Italian Grand Prix. And this is the Italian Grand Prix, 1970. If you were listening to our podcast about heroes of the 50s and the 60s, then you know that Jochen Rindt, who was the number one driver at Team Lotus, had a brake shaft failure going into the parabolica, huge accident, and it killed him. What was interesting is that the number 2 driver at Lotus was a guy named John Miles, and he was so upset by what had happened to Rindt that he quit Formula One on the spot, leaving Team Lotus with one driver who just happened to be a 23-year-old Brazilian kid just doing his 4th Grand Prix. And so now Fittipaldi's the team leader of just this horribly shaken up and demoralized Team Lotus. And he was given the task that was exactly what Graham Hill was given 2 years earlier when Jim Clark died, which was he had to be the guy to step in, galvanize the team, pull them back together again, and give them something to cheer about. The difference is that, again, Fittipaldi had 4 races under his belt. Graham Hill was a former world champion. He was already, he was already an established star.
Can I interrupt you right there?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm thinking about our current season, and, maybe people listen to this in 5-10 years, who knows how long. Hopefully we'll be on for a long time. But I'm just thinking about the 2023 season and how rookies kind of got churned through the process. And it sounds like you're telling me it would be like, instead of Nick DeVries in the middle of the season getting sacked, it would be he's now got all the weight of the AlphaTauri team on his shoulders. Is that kind of the analogy to, oh my word. Oh my word.
After 4 races.
After 4 races.
Right.
That's like what, Australia? And we know what happened during Australia and like Crashmageddon. Oh my goodness gracious. That's shocking to me. And then when you talk about this extra car business, I can't imagine just throwing another car and get, like you said, the pipeline of talent that is sitting and watching the field and not having a seat that we
Yeah.
We just ache to see these kids be able to
Yep.
show us their talent. Wow. Okay. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, I've been to his house. It's part of, yeah. So I like that little piece that you threw in there. That's like a different part of my life. So that's cool. Okay. Sorry, I had to interrupt because I needed to put that in context for some of us newbies who are looking at the races. Okay.
Yep.
Please continue, sir.
Sure. So Rent dies.
And in those days, a Grand Prix win was worth 9 points. And Rent had won 5 races, but hadn't finished anything else. So he had 45 points. And the nearest competitor was a guy named Jackie Ickx. And so what really needed to happen was Rent had no way of defending his championship, obviously, since he was dead. And so somebody had to go and take points away from Ickx so that Ickx could not go and close out the world championship and become the world champion himself. Well, so the next race on the calendar, again, only Fittipaldi's 5th race, was the Grand Prix of the United States held at Watkins Glen, New York. And what did Fittipaldi do? Well, he went out and won the 5th race of his career. So that would be like, instead of talking about Nick de Vries, let's think about Piastri winning the 5th race of the season for him.
Wow.
Right. So
yeah.
I mean,
wow.
I mean, the fact that, we give Piastri a lot of props because he won a sprint race this year. How about a Grand Prix and have it be his 5th one? So anyway, yeah, pretty crazy. So everybody is sort of like, okay, Fittipaldi is a coming star. Lots expected of him in 1971. But the truth of the matter is that 71 was a learning season for Fittipaldi. There was a lot of tracks that he had not been to. Formula One is a different beast from Formula 2. And on top of that, he and his wife were involved in a road car accident that left both of them injured. It wasn't Fittipaldi's fault, apparently, but it was definitely a setback for sure. But getting through 71, it helped him to grow, obviously. And it all came right in 1972 with Emerson winning the world championship by taking 5 of that season's 12 races. So pretty impressive run of success for him at a very early stage. And so with that, now you have Fittipaldi at 25 years old, defending champion, comes into 1973. 2 things happened. One, Jackie Stewart got a new Tyrrell that was very, very effective. And the second, and so Stewart was suddenly really, really quick again. And the other issue is that he had Fittipaldi had a new teammate in the form of Ronnie Peterson from Sweden. And Peterson was known throughout his career as being one of these guys that was super, super quick. And so, as it turned out, in 1973, that proved to be the case. Peterson took 9 poles to Fittipaldi's 1, and Peterson took 4 wins to Fittipaldi's 3. Fittipaldi finished second in the world championship to Jackie Stewart just by dint of his consistency. Peterson did not finish as many races. Therefore, Fittipaldi was able to score more points. So, I mean, that was just one of those lessons that, if you can't be the fastest guy out there, at least finish high when you can, right? And so, at the end of the 73 season, Fittipaldi, not too crazy about having to face Peterson again, decided that he was going to accept a very lucrative offer from McLaren, that at the time was backed by Marlboro. And so they had plenty of money. And so he jumps into the new McLaren M23, which had debuted in 1973. And they had spent a year, making it better and refining it and all that. And sure enough, he paid McLaren back very handsomely with another world championship. He won 3 races at a total of 7 podiums. So he had a very good season then. And then in 1975, he finished second to Niki Lauda. And so, really from 1970 to 1975, if you throw out, the troubles that he had in 1971, he had a pretty unbelievable career, really. I mean, it was really going well. But then his brother Wilson got the idea of forming an all-Brazilian Formula One team. Wilson had secured the backing from a huge Brazilian sugar company, basically. And so with that backing, he convinced his brother, Emerson, is his kid brother, to come on board and drive in this car called the Cooper's car. And it was an absolute shock move when Fittipaldi made this move, because here's a startup team. Nobody knew anything about it. Nothing was known about it. And here he was jumping ship from one of the best teams to a completely unknown team, but a team run by his brother. Anyway, that particular team competed from 1976 to 1982. But Emerson stopped driving in 1980. The car was simply uncompetitive. And it was really difficult to find any sponsors. And so when he retired in 1980, he spent 2 years kind of managing the team and sponsor chasing and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of 92, the Fittipaldi brothers shut that team down. And obviously it's been out of existence for years. I can remember watching that in 1980 at the Long Beach Grand Prix, which was when, it was not an IndyCar race, but a Formula One race. I was there and I saw Fittipaldi in what we didn't know, but this was going to be its last season of driving, trying to make a ground effect Cooper's car work. And, I was always kind of scratching my head about what had happened to him, because he went from being a front runner to, kind of a back of the pack kind of guy. And it was kind of sad to watch, to be honest with you. But, he made that decision. And so when he retired, everybody was just kind of like, oh, he retired. Yeah, probably needed to. And that was it. Emerson's story doesn't end, though. He eventually unretired from driving. He actually drove in a sports prototype race in Miami. He was splitting his time between Miami and Brazil, as a lot of Brazilians do. And he was enticed to go drive in a sports car race that was being held there in Miami. And he got the bug again. And so he decided to start racing. And so he got involved in IndyCar racing. And he wound up winning the IndyCar championship one time, and he won 2 Indy 500s as well. He retired for good after had a pretty bad accident in the Michigan 500 driving his IndyCar that broke some vertebrae in his back, and he hadn't been fully recovered and was flying his plane down in Brazil and had a crash near his citrus farm down there. He survived, but after crashing the IndyCar and crashing the airplane, he decided that, maybe it's time for me to retire for good. And so he did. And today he runs his farm, his family's citrus business down in Brazil. And of course, there's lots of Fittipaldis to this day racing either in Formula One or in IndyCar. So certainly the either sons, grandsons, or nephews are involved in the sport and have been ever since he retired. So there's been quite a few Fittipaldis coming through at the very top levels of the business. And so really, in many respects, his legacy is that he provided the inspiration for many young Brazilian racers to, have the courage to make the trip from Brazil, go to England, and seek their fame and fortune. And you think about it, you had 2 more Brazilian world champions. You had a couple more Brazilians who could have been world champions, and Felipe Massa and Rubens Barrichello. But there's been more Brazilians beyond just those guys. And so it's, he really started a movement there for the country of Brazil. In addition, kind of picked up the mantle a little bit that Jackie Stewart had put down in terms of safety. And there's a couple of times when he led a driver's revolt when they felt like circuit standards were not up to scratch. And they never canceled the race at Fittipaldi's behest, but they certainly delayed the start of a race weekend because they felt that guardrails were unsafe or whatever, and they made the organizers put it right before they went out on track. And I think this is a great example of a situation where, the bulk of the racers were professionals, but the bulk of the organizers at that time were kind of amateurish, if you really want to know the truth. So that's one of the really, and a really interesting character, I think.
You nor the audience can see my head nodding of thinking that's such a good tie-in to our other discussions about safety and how the sport has progressed. And I like how you noted the amateur aspect of, organizers versus the professionalism of the drivers. And then again, with what you said at the beginning about the fact that he had that engineering background, I think those are all key points to remember. Okay, so let's move on to our next person who's probably out of this list, one of the most well-known of the past generation of F1 drivers because of the movie Rush.
Yeah, Niki Lauda, right? And so,
man, that was an interesting cat. There's a guy who had this really unshakable self-belief because of what he had to do. He came from a wealthy family, and I think he was probably instilled with a very pragmatic head for business. And yet at the same time, he really did not get on well with his family. His family did not want him to race, but he felt like this was his best shot at doing something where he actually made a name for himself. And so using the Lauda family name, he secured bank loans, he cashed in life insurance policies, wherever it took, to get his way into Formula One. And honestly, when he first started racing, he drove for March, which was not a competitive car. And eventually, as they talk about in the movie, he went to work driving for BRM on a very interesting, pay-to-drive scheme that he eventually was able to get his contract torn up because of his ability to set up a car and do that engineering and make it work right. And when Ferrari came knocking, he bought his way out of his BRM contract to go to Ferrari. And of course, after his first drive at the test facility at Ferrarano in the new Ferrari, he promptly told old man Ferrari that the car was a piece of piece of crap, and which you're not supposed to say. But he said, "Don't worry, we're going to make it faster." And so, sure,
especially to a Ferrari, right?
Right, especially to a Ferrari. It got other people in trouble. We'll be talking about that in a minute. But anyway, he had a good 1974. He won a handful of races with them. And then in 1975, it all came right. And Lauda won his first world championship. The thing about Niki, though, is that he's known for several things. One is just his huge accident and subsequent recovery from a crash that he had at the Nürburgring at the German Grand Prix in 1976. And that's what a lot of the movie Rush is about, right? And he was narrowly beaten for the world championship that year by James Hunt, who strung together a really good season. And really, Lauda actually aided Hunt's cause in the very last race of the season when he famously pulled out of that race. It was just pouring cats and dogs. And most of the drivers said the race had no business going on, but because of television, they did it anyway. Lauda drove 2 or 3 laps, came in and said, "No, it's too dangerous. I'm not doing this." And Hunt later said that was one of the bravest things that actually any racing driver's ever done, which is to just say, "No, we're not going to do this." And so anyway, he was known to have this very, very clinical approach to racing. He had a very much a no-nonsense work ethic. I think Lauda, in many respects, was obviously an exceptional talent, but his work ethic is what pushed him forward. And he was also known for being brutally honest and unsentimental. I love a story that I read about him. He claimed that his mounting collection of useless trophies was cluttering up his home in Austria, so he gave them to a local garage in exchange for free car washes. And I'm kind of like, man, I wonder what those trophies must be worth today.
No kidding.
Somebody's got them. Somebody has them. So, but what a great story, right? And that just sounds like the Lauda that we know. Anyway, Ferrari was just incensed that he pulled out of the race in Japan, handing the championship to Hunt and McLaren. So Lauda came back in 76 because now the relationship between Lauda and the leadership at Ferrari, not good. And just because of his work ethic and just the fact that he's unsentimental and so hardened, he went out, won the world championship, and promptly left them for Brabham. And so he raced at Brabham for until the 1979 season. And the 1979 Brabham really wasn't very good. And so midway through practice at the Canadian Grand Prix, he came in and said, you know what? I'm kind of done with this. I'm going to go do something else. And so he went out and formed Lauda Air. He was actually an airline captain for a few years, flying for his own airline. And eventually, though, his airline needed cash, and he figured the best way to do that was to go back being a racing driver. So he went back, and McLaren gave him a test, figured out that he was still quick, and so they hired him. And at the time, for the astronomical sum of $5 million a season, which I don't know what that would convert to today. It was a lot back then. I don't think it's anything like what the drivers today are being paid, but it was still a tidy sum. And so anyway, he stayed on at McLaren, won another world championship, and then finally retired for good. Lauda Air was eventually shut down. They had a huge crash of one of their 767s in Thailand that really, really shook Lauda to the core. Several hundred people died in that crash. And as a result, he eventually kind of lost his stomach for the airline business, got out, and later became a team principal for Jaguar when Jaguar was there in the sport. And eventually he became the non-executive chairman of the board for Mercedes F1. And he's the one who persuaded Lewis Hamilton to join Mercedes. And of course, we know the history there. It was a incredibly successful partnership. And so anyway, towards the end of Lauda's life, his injuries from that crash in 1976 at the Nürburgring finally caught up to him because, his lungs had been so damaged. And so he had a kidney transplant. And then a few years later, he had lung transplants. And, but at the end of the day, he passed away in 2019. So, he had quite the life, was quite the character. One of the fallouts a couple of the fallouts from his crash at the Nürburgring was one, the Nürburgring was no longer used for the German Grand Prix because it simply was too dangerous. It's what the drivers for years have been saying anyway. And the other thing is that his injuries from that crash would not have been as severe as they were had his helmet not come off in the middle of the crash. And if you watch the real video of his crash, you can see the helmet come off. And what had happened was, of all things, the chin strap failed. And so they studied what had happened, figured out how the chin strap must have failed. And there's now specifications for racing helmets that go around how the chin strap is supposed to be constructed and attached to the helmet. So there you go. Another safety, another step forward in safety for drivers.
Yeah. Wow. That is very interesting. And the fact that it took time to get the emergency response also affect the location for the race was closed out?
Oh, yeah. I mean...
Okay. Because it's so lengthy, right?
It was pretty lengthy. I mean, of course, in a gasoline fire, lengthy is, it probably measured in, a few tens of seconds, right? But, you know, I mean, he had 4 guys that were race drivers stop, jump in through the flame and pull him out of the car. They got to him before the marshals did.
And then going to the Mercedes and you talking about his brutally honest, unsentimental, kind of clinical approach, it makes me think about all the years of Mercedes' success and how having someone like that as executive chairman of the board who knows what it takes and also has sacrificed a lot for the sport, and then having that kind of person who's just going to be like, nope, here's what we need to do. And now we watch in the wake of his absence, Mercedes not quite being there, but then you hope that the culture still has that initial DNA that would hopefully have been built during his lifetime and influence there.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me to hear how you talk about him. So let's move on to another driver. It's actually another Brazilian that made it onto your short list. And he has a connection actually to the current multi-year F1 champion.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And we're talking about Nelson Piquet. And Nelson Piquet, he followed on the heels of Emerson Fittipaldi's success. You know, here we had another quick Brazilian whose parents did not want him to race. So he raced in Brazil under an assumed name, just like Fittipaldi did. And what was interesting about Piquet is that while he was not really known for his raw speed, he was certainly quick enough. And he had great racecraft, was a little bit on the sneaky side. And so he managed to win 3 world championships, 2 for Brabham, who was his first big team that he drove for. And then he went to Williams and won another one there. You know, he was a personality that was both charming and yet at the same time, apparently, he really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so, very much an enigma. But in 1978, he goes to England. He wins 13 of 26 Formula 3 races that he enters. So really impressive. And so clearly the Formula 1 team bosses are taking an interest in him. And he skipped Formula 2 and went straight to Formula 1 via the Ensign team. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the Ensign team was founded by a gentleman named Morris Nunn, who was an engineer designer and had a very, very small Formula 1 team back in the 70s and was known as a bit of a talent spotter. And his partner was none other than a gentleman, an American named Chuck Jones, who was a wealthy businessman from California who backed that team. And Chuck is the dad of one of my very dear friends who is still in the business. So my friend's dad gave Nelson Piquet his first ride, and my friend Sean was there when Piquet made his debut in Formula 1. Anyway, he proved to be promising. So he was snapped up by Bernie Ecclestone, who by that time owned the Brabham Formula 1 team, and they made him the number 2 driver to Niki Lauda. And when Lauda retired from driving on the first try, Piquet then became the team leader of Brabham, winning 3 races in 1980 and finishing second in the World Championship to Alan Jones. One of the guys that you mentioned is, hey, how come we're not talking about Alan Jones? Well, we sort of are. And so anyway, Jones was driving for Williams. And so the following year, Piquet kind of did what was kind of his mode of operation, which is he wins 3 races and the World Championship because he strung together a lot of really good finishing positions when he wasn't winning. In 1982, they had the turbocharged BMW engine put in the back of the Brabham, and because they just had reliability issues to iron out, he only won a single race. And the rest of the time, you know, there's a lot of did not finishes next to his name. And so 1982 was pretty forgettable for him. But it all came right a second time in 1983 because he won the world championship again. And once again, he won when he could, but he was super consistent. And he did it at a time when he had become very fond of the whole jet setter playboy kind of lifestyle, even though he hated the publicity, but he liked the lifestyle that went with it. And he'd actually thought about quitting racing because of all the travel and all that kind of stuff. He just, Piquet always said he was really lazy. And so he got talking to Niki Lauda, and Lauda said, "Oh, you just need to get a private jet. It makes life a whole lot easier because you don't spend so much time on the road." So Piquet went out and bought himself a private jet. It was like, oh, yeah, well, maybe this isn't so bad after all. And, he was still quick and all that kind of stuff. So, for 84 and 85, he was driving for Brabham, but he really wanted to get paid more, and Ecclestone really didn't want to pay him more. So in 86, Williams basically offered him like 3 times the money that Ecclestone was willing to pay him. And he jumped to Williams to partner with Nigel Mansell. Well, the partnership between Piquet and Mansell is legendary for how much these two guys hated each other. Not much is said about it because the fireworks a few years later between Prost and Senna by far out eclipsed what was going on between Piquet and Mansell. But for 2 years, they were at each other's throats. And in fact, for 1986, their rivalry was so bad that it cost both men the world championship, and they lost out to Alain Prost. So, it's one of those things. It's not just McLaren that has a hard time managing two very talented drivers who both believe they should be the number one guy. But during the 1986 season, Piquet actually went so far as to accuse Williams of playing favorites with Mansell. Here's Piquet as a Brazilian, Mansell as an Englishman driving for an English team. And so Piquet said, "Hey, Williams is playing favorites. Mansell's getting all the latest bits and pieces for the car. He's getting the best engines." And then went on to say some very nasty things about Mansell's wife. Not sure what they were, but it prompted Mansell to say that Piquet was a vile man. So, it just wasn't good. So in 1987, again, history kind of repeated itself. Mansell wins 6 races, Piquet wins 3, but Piquet is more consistent than Mansell, and Piquet wins the world championship a 3rd time. But by that time, he'd pretty much worn out his welcome at Williams, and so he left and went to Lotus, which at that time, Lotus was kind of on the downhill slide. And so he did 2 seasons at Lotus, and he did 2 more years at Benetton, but by that time, his motivation was pretty well gone, and he left Formula One. He did continue to race from time to time, either back in Brazil in touring cars. He tried racing at Indianapolis in 1992, but was badly injured in a practice crash. And it was interesting, he was driving a Lola powered by a Buick engine, believe it or not, stock block engine with twin turbochargers. And a very good friend of mine named Jim Crawford was a mechanic on his car. And he remembers having a number of conversations with Piquet about the next yacht that he was going to buy to put in Monaco Harbor. So anyway, makes for a pretty good story, but Piquet basically felt like that his yacht was way too small, and he needed a yacht big enough to have a helipad on it so he could land his helicopter on the yacht. So, yeah.
I'm sorry. First world, that's what I was thinking. First world problems.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So anyway, like I said, he kind of liked the jet setter lifestyle. Anyway, long story made short, he went back to Brazil, got involved in a number of different businesses, and became hugely successful. And certainly, his son, Nelson Piquet Jr., wound up racing in Formula One. And so, yeah, he certainly has a legacy as a 3-time world champion, a bit of an enigma, but certainly you gotta say that the guy knew that he had to win when he had a car fast enough to win, and he knew he had to score a lot of points when he had a car that couldn't win. So,
Yeah, well, I like how you brought in his son right then, because we've talked about some of the controversies and scandals related to F1, and his son's name is involved in one that's actually reared its head back up in the 2020s right now. So that's so interesting. Okay, so I want to go back to one of the things that you said about he won 3 races in 81, but he still won the world championship, and how you noted the way that he won was by how he placed in all the other races. I think that that's often overlooked in the strategy of, even though you don't necessarily win the race, but if you just keep being tactically smart and being the best driver, and, everything falls, and the other slots that you could get into could still put you into position to win. And I think we see that with some of the other racers you've already talked about, because it gets so tight by the time that you end there. I think we haven't seen that in recent years. It feels like it's kind of a done deal. So that's why I wanted to point that out. I love what you said about the Prost, Senna, Piquet, Mansell, these rivalries. And I think we have to do a conversation just on rivalries. And I say that, and I hope you want to do that. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from any of our audience if they want to hear us talk about that, because that would be a cool topic, in my opinion. Yeah. And the other thing that, as you were talking, I thought was interesting is where you brought up how Piquet made some not so nice comments about Mansell's wife when they were both at Williams. And it made me think of a recent, I think it was last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, some comment, I believe it was alleged. I don't remember if it was actually proven, but an alleged comment that Piquet made about Lewis Hamilton. When I heard you say that, I thought, oh, so this isn't surprising that a person may have said something not so great. I mean, all of us say things that are not so great. And then this not so great feeling between the two of them. I remember when I was reading Adrian Newey's book, he highlighted the challenge of designing a car. I guess, is Piquet a shorter kind of guy? Is he? Yeah. I remember him saying that it was a very difficult design of the cockpit because Mansell is not a small person. And he made it seem like they were really trying to make it fair, but it wasn't always as fair as it could have been because of the sheer size differential between the two guys. Okay. Those are my comments to what you said. The
driving styles are very different too.
Yes, that's right. I've heard from some of our listeners, they really want to hear you talk about driving styles of some of our existing drivers. So anybody else out there who feels that way, let us know. So let's move on to our next racer, who is actually someone I've really wanted to learn a lot more about. When I think of the golden eras of F1, his face is often in the middle of some of these most iconic moments, and it is Alain Prost. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, there's a guy,
he was known as the professor because, he was certainly very, very cunning. He was ruthless. He may not have been the absolute quickest guy out there, but he was plenty quick. And I think it's safe to say that his place in Formula One history as one of the greatest ever is pretty secure. I mean, he did have a career that had a lot of controversy in it. And so that's kind of detracted from his achievements to a certain degree. But, there's no doubt that the guy was super passionate about the sport, super talented. And I mean, when you think about it, he won 4 championships, which at the time was the most that anybody had won, save for Fangio. And he won 51 times, which at the time was a record. And so because he was so technical and very Lauda-like, and let's face it, he was teammates to Lauda, so no doubt he picked up a lot of the cunning and the smarts of Lauda during that particular time. Even though he was quicker than Lauda still beat him for the world championship. And so no doubt in my mind that he learned a lot from Niki. But one of the things that he's really known for is just horrible feud that he had with his teammate Ayrton Senna. And those two guys' career really, you have to say their careers are just tied together to one another because of the rivalry and the hatred that those two guys had for each other. But having said all that, Prost, growing up in France, he took the usual route, raced karts, proved that he was really good. So he moved into national level car racing in France. And again, won there. And so, racing being a meritocracy to a large degree, he then graduated into Formula 3 and won prolifically in Formula 3, which then attracted the attention of Formula 1. So here comes 1980, and McLaren signs him up. Now, right at this time, McLaren had been sold to a man named Ron Dennis, who really took McLaren to a new level. Up until that time, Bruce McLaren had founded McLaren, and one of his good friends was a guy named Teddy Mayer, who handled the business side of it. And when Bruce died, Teddy kept running the business along with Bruce's widow, Pat McLaren. And they had built it up to a certain level, but then they decided for whatever reason to get out of it. And so they sold it to Ron Dennis, who had been running a Formula 2 team called Project 4. And so whenever you see a McLaren called an MP421 or something like that, that MP4 is for McLaren Project 4. And so anyway, that little piece of trivia, this was when the first carbon fiber tub came out, and nobody really knew what to think about that. It was a ground effect car, all those kinds of things. And so Prost raced for McLaren in 1980, but then he was on a 2-year deal, but he broke his contract after that because he was worried about the unreliability and the safety of that generation of a McLaren. And what was interesting is that he broke the contract after having broken a wrist, I think it was, driving that McLaren because some part had failed and it sent him crashing off the track. And he was just sort of like, yeah, I'm going to go drive for somebody else. And so Renault was doing some really great things and developing their own car and team. And so he moved to Renault in 1981. And so in 1981, here you have Prost, a French driver, driving a Renault, a French car, winning the French Grand Prix. That couldn't have happened too often. I don't think an American driver driving an American car has ever won the U.S. Grand Prix. Yeah, pretty sure of that. So anyway, it would be like a British driver driving for a British team winning the British Grand Prix. So that would be like James Hunt winning the British Grand Prix for McLaren, as an example. So anyway, that didn't happen very often for the French. And so this was a really, really big deal. And ultimately, Prost spent 3 years at Renault, won 9 races, but then he fell out of favor with Renault's management. They preferred René Arnoux as sort of a more fan-friendly kind of guy. And Arnoux was not the race winner, but he was more appealing to the fans. And so Prost left and he went to McLaren. And so when that happened, that's really where the legend of Prost really began, because in the following 6 seasons with McLaren, he won 30 races and 3 world championships and finished second in the world championship twice. So a remarkable record over the span of 6 seasons. But shortly after Prost got to McLaren, here comes Ayrton Senna. Senna left Lotus, had felt like he'd gotten all he could out of Lotus, goes to McLaren, and the first season together, Prost and Senna got along just fine, but then after a while, Prost realized he couldn't keep pace with Senna at all. So he had to use his skill and cunning, much the same way as Stewart and Lauda and Piquet and all those guys, to win championships. Just really, I mean, think Piquet having to deal with Mansell. And so when that happened, then it all came to a head because Prost had to do something to keep Senna from winning another world championship. They had both won world championships by that time. And it all came to a head at the Japanese Grand Prix. Towards the end of the race, Prost had worked out that if both of them didn't finish the Japanese Grand Prix, it didn't matter that the season finale was in Australia. Prost would clinch the world championship. And so Senna made a move going into the chicane at Suzuka, and Prost deliberately turned into him, took himself out of the race, but damaged Senna's car enough that Senna was not able to score points. There was some steward involvement in that as well. Lots of controversy, lots of politics. But anyway, at the end of the day, Prost won the world championship. Senna was relegated to second. And it really comes down to the fact that Prost took them both out of the race. The following year, Prost then went on to drive for Ferrari. And so what was interesting about that is that Prost didn't have to deal with Senna as a teammate, but he still had to deal with him on the racetrack. And guess what? They come into the Japanese Grand Prix once again. They're in a position, but this time Senna does the mental math, figures out that if both of them DNF, he automatically clinches the world championship. So the race starts, green lights go on. They go down to the very first corner. Senna drives straight into the side of Prost, takes him straight into the gravel traps, into the tire barriers, crashes both cars out of the race. He gets out of the car, looks at Prost, and walks away. And he's the world champion. And so that kind of gives you an idea of just the rivalry that those two guys had. Anyway.
Wait. Hold on. That's like a lot that you dropped there. I'm like, my mouth is on the floor when you tell me what just happened. Like okay. So I guess because for most new people, right, in the last 10 years, the most controversial ending of a season was Abu Dhabi, 2022? Is that right? Is that 21? Yeah, I always get the years confused. And people are still talking about that. But this is like multi-year controversy. I mean, I can't even like fully grasp first Prost doing what he did. And then when you said the stewards had to take action, I was like, okay, considering how the stewards and their decision making has been questioned in the last seasons, I'm just thinking, wow, that would have been such a controversy feels like it's not even the right word for it. And then to go to the next year and for Senna to do what you're saying he did, it's like, well, turnabout is fair play. And also even a little bit of poetic justice, karma, all of the above. Like, wow, talk about drive to survive. Like, you need that for back then so you can see all of that.
Yeah. I mean, these guys, the blind ambition, the hatred for each other, the desire to beat the other guy, it was all a full display. And to me, the hilarious thing, and Prost is French, so I'm not going to hold this against him, but if it just sums it up beautifully, because after Senna took him out of the 1990 race, and here's a McLaren crashing into a Ferrari, Prost says, what he did was disgusting. He is a man without value. I'm kind of like, seriously? So, it's pretty rich when you consider what he did in 1989. So,
yes,
ever.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, it is. I mean, wow.
Yeah. So, just craziness. So anyway, obviously he left McLaren in a cloud, right? And I mean, he could crash into Senna and not really care about any repercussions from McLaren because he knew he was going to Ferrari the next year anyway. And so then, he loses the world championship in 1990, courtesy of Senna and his shenanigans in Japan. And then in 1991, Ferrari lost their way with just the design of the car. Does that sound familiar? And so Prost criticized the car about 3/4 of the way through, and Ferrari fired him because, he dared to criticize the Scuderia. The only guy that I guess has ever really gotten away with that is Lauda.
Right.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. The Lewis controversy is currently happening again. We don't know how long from now people will be listening to this. Maybe this is like ancient history and totally a blip on the radar. But I would want to say, Lewis, take note as you head over to Ferrari, making your complaint or making any criticisms. Be very, very mindful of that.
Oh, yeah.
So because he was fired so late in the season, there was no rides that were suitable for him to take. So he sat out in 1992. He was like a, TV commentator and that kind of stuff. But in 93, he joined Williams, who had the FW14, and that was a car. And so, Prost joins Williams. Mansell had won the world championship in 1992. Prost joins Williams in 93, wins 7 more races, and wins his 4th world championship. And after hearing that Senna would be joining him at Williams for the 1984 season, Prost says, yeah, I think I've had enough. He retired for good rather than have to deal with Senna again, which I can't say I blame him. So anyway, the story for Prost is today, well, before we get to today, he did buy out the Ligier Formula One team and renamed it Prost. And he owned a Formula One team from 1997 to 2001, but it never really was successful. Raising sponsorship money was tough. And so that team closed at the stores in 2001. They did give Jenson Button a test though. So, they certainly had some, good talent coming through the day. Anyway, today Alain is seen at F1 races. And in the near past, he's been an advisor to Renault, or now Alpine. So, interesting guy.
Yes, and great summary for someone like me who's wanted to learn a little bit more about him. So let's move on to our final person. His name has come up in various aspects during our other episodes. And as with Jackie Stewart, he is someone you truly admire. You mentioned that earlier in this episode. And if anyone wants to hear your story about being in Brazil and your honoring of this driver, Ayrton Senna, they need to check out your F1 origin story. So tell us, I know this is a hard ask for you to drill down on someone you so respect, but I have confidence in you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, you can't talk about Senna without also talking about Prost and vice versa, right? Because they're so linked to each other. And in the case of Senna, hugely popular to the sport, incredibly exciting, and yet one of the really, truly polarizing figures that F1 has ever seen. You loved him or hated him, And, Senna was born to a very wealthy Brazilian family. He did not have to race for the financial reward. Rather, he had to race because that's what he did. He was a racer. And like Fittipaldi and Piquet before him, Senna developed a winning reputation at home in Brazil. He started racing karts at a very young age. And he had this massive self-belief that he had the talent to make it to Formula One. So he went to Europe and raced in the various junior formulas that all young drivers need to succeed in, including Formula 3. And when he proved to be very talented, he landed a seat in the Toleman Formula One team for 1984. And I will tell you that the Toleman was if you look it up, it's probably out in Wikipedia, but it was a really ungainly looking car. And yet Senna made it go pretty well in the wet in particular, because the deficiencies of the car were masked by the rain. And as it turned out, earlier in the year in 1984 at Monaco, it was a race that was just pouring with rain. And Senna brought that car home in second place. So a pretty amazing result for a guy who was a rookie, but it showed just how gifted that guy was, especially in the rain. Senna had no problem going flat out in the rain, whereas Prost was just hated racing in the rain. And so anytime it rained, Senna had an immediate advantage because he had no problem going and just hanging it way out there. In 1984, there was a United States Grand Prix. At the time, I think it was either the second or maybe the third one that was held that season in the United States. And it was held at Fair Park here in Dallas. And they shut down the roads going through Fair Park, turned it into a Formula One circuit. The garages were set up in one of the buildings there on the fairgrounds. And I got to see Senna and Lauda and Prost and all those guys race Formula One cars on a very narrow track that had asphalt that had no way could it stand up to 1,000 horsepower and ground effects. They were literally peeling the asphalt off the road, but it really showed his talent because I had gone there. I had heard of Senna. Everybody had said he was really, really special, and I actually got to watch him race. So it was pretty cool. Anyway, in 1985, he realized he was going nowhere fast with Tolman. So he moved to Lotus. And for 3 seasons, he drove for Lotus. And he won 16 pole positions and 6 races. And his first race came in the race win came in the rain at Portugal. And like I'd said earlier, when it started raining, Senna was just nearly unbeatable. And so he went out and won his first Grand Prix there. And it was one of those races that to this day is thought of as being something pretty special. In 1988, he felt like he'd done pretty much everything he could do with McLaren. So he came to McLaren and stayed there for 6 seasons. And in those 6 seasons, he won 35 races and 3 world championships. And so, as we talked about earlier, this rivalry that he had with Prost was, really, it was the stuff of legends. And behind the wheel, the depth of Senna's commitment was there for everyone to see. And just the spectacle of watching Senna on a qualifying lap or one of his charges through the field after, he got knocked off the track or whatever, it really made it one of those deals where you kind of thought, man, this guy is just an accident waiting to happen. And over time, it became clear that he just had such amazing car control and all that, he was really, truly something special. And what was interesting is if you ever watched like his qualifying lap from Monaco, it's either 1988 or 1989, you can launch it and you can kind of go, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But then if you go and you put it on slow motion and you watch him go through some of the hairpins at Monaco, his hands are so fast you can't see it in real time, but in slow motion you see that he's in full opposite lock with his left hand going around a corner, and he's reaching down and grabbing a gear with his right hand. He takes his hand completely off the steering wheel, car is completely sideways, and he's grabbing another gear so he can go faster. It's just absolutely incredible. And he talked about having out-of-body experiences while he was driving the car, that he literally could see himself above the car and watching himself drive the car around Monaco, which is, he went to places that other people just didn't go. And so when he talked about being committed, he actually redefined the whole idea about commitment, much like Schumacher went and redefined the idea about what kind of condition a racing driver should be in physically. And so the in the case of that qualifying run there for the Monaco Grand Prix in 1988, he admitted that he went too far and that he had actually become this passenger on this ride that he had taken. And he admitted later that it had frightened him. And he said, I realized I was well beyond my conscious understanding. And so he drove back to the pits, took a deep breath, and he did not go out again on that day. Ultimately, in 1994, of course, as we discussed, he joined Williams, which prompted Prost to retire the second time. And he was given a car that was not the same car that Prost and Mansell had. It had the active ride suspension for Prost and Mansell, but in this one, the rules had changed, and so a conventional suspension had to be fitted to this car, and it was no longer the amazing race car that Prost had hoped for. And so he never won a race for Williams, but was leading the San Marino Grand Prix when he went off at Tamburello Corner in May 1st of 1994 in a crash that killed him. And that crash today is not fully explained, although it is believed that because they were still trying to figure out how to set the car up with a passive suspension, the car bottomed out, the airflow underneath the car stopped, all downforce went out of the car for just a few, fractions of a second, but it was enough to pitch him off the track and into a concrete barrier at over 150 miles an hour. And so anyway, a suspension piece came through and speared Senna and killed him. At the time of his death, his wealth was estimated to be at around $400 million. And he had set up a foundation in his name that is for the impoverished children of Brazil, which is still in place today. If you buy a Senna t-shirt, it goes to that foundation. Ultimately, the proceeds in terms of profits are then put in for the kids of Brazil. Interestingly enough, on that foundation, one of the board of directors is none other than Alain Prost. So things have a way of coming around. And Prost was one of Senna's pallbearers at Senna's funeral. So amazing.
Oh, wow. You would not, if you were writing a script, that would be, again, kind of poetic, but you wouldn't really think that when you think about humans in real life, they don't do what you script them to do, right? So that's beautiful on both on the foundation.
Yeah, and an interesting sidebar to that, when Prost said, hey, I'm retiring at the end of the 1993 season, the last race of the year, both Senna and Prost were on the podium together last time that they were going to do that. And Senna reached over and picked up, grabbed Prost's hand and raised it in the air like champion.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, it was sort of like this, my biggest rival has now retired. I'm sending him off, and I no longer hate this guy. Incredible. Senna was a very complex guy.
Yeah, I can't remember which of the documentaries I had watched about him, and or maybe I had listened to an interview that Alain Prost had done where he said, I feel like the winter before the accident, they'd maybe in the same city or something, or they had somebody had a chalet is all I remember, and that they had some pretty deep conversation. And of course, that's after he's retired. So what you just said makes a lot of sense, that like the road for reconciliation, if Senna had continued on in life, we probably would have seen a friendship develop. So, okay, you talked about the crash, and we won't go into all the details, but what I want to point out, you mentioned things like downforce and ground effect. Those are concepts that we have recorded, and as a part of our tech conversations. And I think that for our listeners, I don't know where this episode will fall in relation to those more tech-based episodes, but I think those will help in understanding a little bit about why even those few seconds of the loss of downforce could have created such a tragedy of the loss of Senna. So I wanted to just kind of point that out. We're not that smart that we are intentionally overlapping as much as we'd like to be, but I want to point that out for our audience. The other thing I thought was beautiful that you said was that Senna is often spoken of about being the committed person, and he defined commitment, and that like Schumacher, who defined driver fitness, and both of them changed the sport. I just think that's a really good example of how we could talk about icons of a sport, and like when you say committed and then when you say driver fitness, and that we in 2023, 24, or whatever year you're listening to this, these are names and people of why we should really respect what they've done. But Dick, you had a hard ask in all of this, but especially with Senna, I have to say, and I personally think you did a great job. And I can't wait till we move into the next era of legends in the world of F1. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.